much. First, I'm going to go down memory lane, thanks to Muriel Salle and Catherine Vital's book. I took a lot of inspiration from the historical part of this book. And this is just to get you riled up and to make you realize that we have to start taking some political steps in deciding whether or not we're going to integrate gender into our health research here in France. So, of course, there's a weight of history. I'll just read in English this quotation from a French doctor in the 18th century. A woman is a being that nature has put on the edge of a cliff, just waiting to swallow her up. So, as Muriel wrote so well and synthesized so well in her book, from the 4th century before our era up until the 18th century, what dominated scientific thought about the differences between men and women was the theory of temperament. Women's temperament was cold and humid, therefore her organs were inside her body, while those of the man, while the temperament of a man was hot and dry, and thus his organs were outside his body. Throughout the 18th century, this theory is going to be progressively replaced by the insistence on anatomical differences between men and women, the idea being that these bodily differences influence greatly the difference between the two sexes. And another French doctor, Dr. Viser, wrote, sexual differences are not only limited to the reproductive organs of men and women, but to all the parts of their bodies. Even those that appear unrelated to reproduction are influenced by these sexual differences. 1823. In the 18th century and all throughout the 19th century, the idea or the invention of what is called women's nature became predominant. And all of this, by the way, harks back to Sarah's chart that she showed us this morning, how scientists rely on the specific scientific paradigm of their time. So in the 18th century, the theory of women's nature was developed and has consequences all the way up to this very day. The most ardent defenders of this theory being physicians and scientists, as well as lay people. There's such a thing as a woman's nature and a man's nature. Amal, a French deputy at the convention of 1793, explained that women are inapt and unable to develop intellectual thoughts and serious concepts, therefore they should not be given citizenship rights in the wave of the French Revolution. And Dr. Gustave Le Bon, who's also a French scientist who you all have heard of, women's brains are closer in size to gorillas' brains than to the most developed of men's brains. This inferiority is so obvious that no one may contest it. Only the degree to which women and gorillas' brains are similar merits discussion. So from this inferiority that had been, more or less reiterated throughout the centuries and proven by scientific theory, of women's inferior position to men, followed a long series of affirmations that we are still trying to untangle and unravel on women's natures, whose main characteristics are that of being weak and predestined to maternity. Her only anatomical superiority was an increased ramification of exquisite sensitivity, as it was called, but also this meant a larger tendency to be irritable, to harbor acute sensations which consequently prevent women from being able to use their reason. This medical discourse on women throughout the 19th century is going to consistently confuse the normal with the pathological. And to better establish women's inferiority, the discourse is going to point to their menstrual cycles, their pregnancies, their menopause, making of them perpetually sick people. Also defining them as mothers-only mothers. And this particular aspect is going to push scientists or incite scientists to study more particularly women's uterus. The whole entire female physiology being read through the prism of this organ. And Dr. Murat wrote in 1822, this viscera acts upon the entire female system in quite an obvious manner, dictating the complete sum of women's actions and affectations. And I still hear people say that today, some people. So, what happened? We all know the history of feminism. We all know that there's still a lot of history of feminism that has to be done prior to the suffragettes. But to make a long story short, we can say that it began with the suffragettes, who I should add were also in favor of women's votes because of women's exquisite sensitivity for the most part. They felt that they could bring to the public arena the womanly qualities and would improve the political environment. Then we had the first wave of feminist movements in the 60s and the second wave in the 70s and the 80s. This second wave is going to contribute to the development, rapid and spread out development of a large amount of research in social sciences and humanities, but also in biology and medicine in American universities and in some European universities. And I can't insist enough upon the importance of this second wave movement. We always seem to forget that feminism is a big part of what we're doing today, is thanks to feminist movements, and so thanks to political mobilization and organization. Throughout the 70s and 80s, we witnessed the creation of departments such as women's studies, and they became feminist studies, and now we have seen in the United States and in some countries the emergence of gender studies and intersectionality studies. The awareness began, and I will go very quickly because it was already mentioned a little bit this morning, awareness of the problem in biomedical research was going to be brought to the fore by American first social science researchers who began to alert to the fact that women were absent from studies. We've already mentioned this, so I'm not going to get into it. They found that researchers accepted the idea, the all too easily acceptable idea that the prototype of the human being or the human body was the male body and the woman was perceived as other. We mentioned this already this morning. At the same time as these feminists began to decry the absence of women in studies, a group of bipartisan women representatives in the House of Representatives, Democrats and Republicans, I don't know if you can see that today, began to call for and mobilize and lobby in favor of including women in studies, but not only including women in studies, but opening up the NIH and the FDA to a more global inclusion of women in biomedical studies. For example, in the House, what was underlined especially was the fact that, again, studies were being carried out only on men. In the Senate, Olympia Snowe, who was a Republican, brought up another study where breast cancer or uterus cancer had been carried out only on men. So this brought fruit to these groups of women and to who were then followed by, of course, numerous scientists and the NIH itself. A law was passed in 1993 which integrated the Office of Research on Women's Health into the NIH. And we saw this a little bit with Iniku. Now the NIH has to do all of the things that she said and all the things that are up there. And in the same year, in 1993, the Food and Drug Administration also began to issue not only guidelines, but regulations for pharmaceutical companies to follow a certain number of rules concerning clinical essays in phase 1 and 2. These new directives allowed for the inclusion of women for the first time in these first phases of experimentation, on the condition that they received contraception, free contraception. Now, before it was thought that if they were subject to this research, their future fetuses were going to be impaired. This changed in 1993, and since 1993, and Inika mentioned it a bit, there is a very important amount of money and infrastructure and human resources that turn around the objective of women and health. Gender and health, that's another story. We can maybe talk about it in the discussion. So what did this create? This created a snowball effect throughout the world. And here is just a short list, many of which Inika has already mentioned. And all we need to do in France is join the list. Next year, I'd love to see a little French gender and health link under there. Thank you.